Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Virtual Kant Congress. The session today will be curated by the Kant-Gesellschaft. And we would like to thank Dietmar Heidemann for putting the session together and Konstantin Pollock for kindly accepting to chair it. And I just would like to mention that if you could turn on your cameras, if at all possible, so that we can have this impression that we're all sharing the same physical space. And also that after the session, as usual, we'll leave this Zoom meeting open after the recording stops for more informal conversations, and you're all very welcome to stay. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Konstantin Pollock. Many thanks for being part of this Congress. We are very much looking forward to the session today.
All right. Hello, everyone, and good evening from Germany. First of all, thanks to the organizers of this virtual Kant Congress for setting up this wonderful forum. On behalf of the Kant-Gesellschaft, it's my great pleasure tonight to join this series of Kant societies from around the world. And I just learned, and I'm expected to say a few words on the Kant-Gesellschaft. Kant-Gesellschaft has a long history. It goes back to 1904, when Hans Vaihinger in Halle founded the Kant-Gesellschaft in memory of Immanuel Kant's death 100 years earlier. And during the first half of the 20th century, it sort of went to sleep, and well, during World War II, of course. But it was refounded in 1969 by Gerhard Funke, and it had and still has the goal of the Förderung und Verbreitung des Studiums der kantischen Philosophie. That's the promotion and dissemination of this study of Kant's philosophy. We also added the Kant-Studien, the journal Kant-Studien, and the Kant-Studien-Ergänzungshefte, and we do participate in the organization and also are involved in the funding of the Kant Congress. All right, now that this eventful anniversary year, 300 years Kant, comes to a close, we would like to draw the attention to the next generation of Kant scholars. So the speakers tonight are advanced grad students Lucia Volonté, Jing Gao, and Julian Greve, who will soon finish their dissertations on certain aspects of Kant's philosophy. So please let me introduce our first speaker, Lucia Volonté. She earned her BA degree in philosophy in 2016 from the University of Milan, and in 2018, her MA, also philosophy, also at the University of Milan. In 2019, or from 2019 to 2020, she held a pre-doc scholarship at the Artes Graduate School at the University of Cologne. And since 2020, she's been working under my supervision on her dissertation, the working title of which is Kant's Notion of Spontaneity Between Objective Cognition and Transcendental Freedom. And the title of her talk today is Kant on Transcendental Freedom, a comparison between the notes on metaphysics and the third antinomy. Please, Lucia.
Thanks. So thank you, Konstantin, for the introduction. Many thanks to the organizer of the Virtual Kant Congress, and also thanks to the Kant-Gesellschaft for giving me the opportunity to present today. I will share my screen. Okay. So my topic today is transcendental freedom, and transcendental freedom is a major debate in Kant studies. And indeed, seminal works have been devoted to the concept of freedom and its development. However, most investigation into Kant's pre-critical view have tended to focus on the concept of transcendental freedom from a practical moral perspective in relation to the spontaneity of the will, drawing especially on the Pöhlig's lectures on metaphysics and Kant's notes on metaphysics from the same period. While the Pöhlig's lectures offer a precise characterization of transcendental freedom in terms of absolute spontaneity as a transcendental predicate of the soul, I think that they are not an exhaustive exposition of the precritical concept of transcendental freedom, because the cosmological significance of this concept is overshadowed. For this reason, the aim of my paper and my presentation here is to illustrate the cosmological dimension of Kant's early transcendental freedom. In the Notes on Metaphysics, at the turn of the silent decade, Kant outlines transcendental freedom as a principle of causality without appealing to the notion of spontaneity and in abstraction from any specific concern with human agency and morality. So in this scope, transcendental freedom points to the metaphysical principle of origination that reason must assume in order to give a series of cognition a first unconditioned ground. I will proceed as follows. First, I will examine the Notes on Metaphysics in order to show not only Kant's early discussion of transcendental freedom, but also the questions underlying it and the way in which Kant demonstrates the possibility of transcendental freedom as a cosmological concept. Especially the analogy with the concept of the absolutely necessary being reveals the specific role of transcendental freedom within the cosmological framework. Because of the similarities with Kant's account of transcendental freedom in the third antinomy, I will secondly compare the precritical and the critical concept in order to identify the differences between them, and so in order to ask for the aspects of incompatibility between the early concept of transcendental freedom and the system of transcendental idealism. This comparison will show that the main difference lies not only in the concepts of freedom themselves, but also in the different conception of human reason and in the different conception of the relation between freedom and reason. So, presumably beginning with the phase eta, which was dated by Adikes 1764-1768, Kant departs from his previous account of freedom. In the new elucidation, he presents freedom which recalls a relative form of spontaneity of the will, a view that Kant will later call freedom of uttering speech. In these notes, in this set of early notes, Kant draws a contrast between two forms of causality that can account for the beginning of a movement. The causality of nature, which is subject to physical mechanical laws, and freedom, which should respond to another principle. Insofar as human beings are rational, they are capable of freedom, understood, I quote, as all origin of a first beginning. The grounds that determine free action are not part of the series of natural causes, but lies in freedom itself. And the definition of freedom as all origin of a first beginning discloses, I think, a first aspect of novelty compared to the conception of freedom presented in the new elucidation. Both the terms origin and first beginning suggest that freedom is an original, that means an unconditioned form of causality, and therefore entails the ground for the beginning of action. However, there is still a question concerning the possibility of freedom so understood. How can we account for the causality of a first beginning, namely a beginning that is neither relatively first nor subject to the laws of nature, whether mechanical or teleological? So how can we understand the causality of freedom in general? Probably challenged by these questions, Kant introduces for the first time the concept of transcendental freedom. In the note 3863, he distinguishes between practical freedom, spontaneitatis practicitalis, and transcendental freedom. The former is opposed to animality, brutalitate, whereas the latter is opposed to fatalism. In this reflection, Kant presents transcendental freedom in a negative way, namely by distinguishing it both from its opposite, fatalism, and from the concept of practical freedom. While practical freedom, as Kant shows elsewhere, points to the independence from the necessitation according to one's own sensible nature and therefore means the self-activity of an intellectual power of choice, transcendental freedom refers here to the independence from blind necessity, namely the necessitation of all existence by an external blind cause. Kant elaborates on the cosmological concepts of freedom in further notes of the second half of the 1760s. Although Kant rarely uses the term transcendental in this reflexion, I think that the concept of freedom outlined in them recalls the distinction between practical freedom and transcendental freedom, and also the definition of the latter as opposed to fatalism, and therefore the cosmological dimension of this concept. In the note 3906, which was written next to the paragraphs titled Notio Mundi Negativa of Baumgarten's cosmology, Kant introduces freedom among the possible causes of the occurrence of events in the world, namely, along with brute necessity, fate or destiny, and chance. Drawing on the non datur principia of the rational cosmology, Kant takes natural necessity and freedom as the only possible forms of causation of events in the world. Kant expands on this idea in the 1770s, especially in the Prolix lectures. In the section of the cosmology entitled On Destiny and Chance, Kant rejects both chance and destiny not only because they are groundless, but also because they imply that any event is either contingent or necessary in every respect. But only God can be said to exist absolutely necessary. Everything that happens is contingent in one respect and necessary in other respect, namely with respect to its cause. While events in nature are contingent in themselves but necessary in relation to the laws of nature and then to God as the first cause, free actions are contingent in relation to the causality of nature but necessary in themselves, because they originate according to an inner ground of freedom. And it is noteworthy that in this section, as also in other notes, Kant presents freedom as the principle of the origination, Entstehung, of action, because, I quote, nothing but freedom can furnish a ground of origination. However, defining freedom in terms of ground of origination does not answer the question of its possibility. Because of the principle of sufficient reason, and here I quote Kant, the rule that nothing contingent is conceivable without a connection to grounds, and that a consequence in time without a ground and an occurrence of something without a connection to its ground cannot be conceived. So according to this principle, Kant observes in the note 3922 that, I quote, it is difficult to conceive our beginning in the series of all things, which everything else succeeds, as a creation. The question that Kant poses is how to conceive of freedom as, I quote, a coming to be without an antecedent determining ground. More specifically, how to conceive of freedom as, I quote, a primary ground that is not comprehended along with that which occurs. And I think that probably with these questions in mind, Kant draws on the parallel between the absolute necessity as the first ground of the series of occurrences in nature and freedom as the first beginning grounded a series of actions. As we will see, the parallel between transcendental freedom and absolute necessity, or better, the absolutely necessary being, allows Kant to further specify the concept of transcendental freedom as a metaphysical principle. In these notes, Kant describes absolute necessity as the first unconditioned ground that determines everything possible. And usually, he refers this concept to God as the highest principle of all possible things, the so-called ens necessarium. So following the analogy to the concept of the absolutely necessary being, I think we can reconstruct Kant's early account of transcendental freedom in terms of the first ground of free actions. In the note 4033, Kant points out that absolute necessity is a problematic concept because no cognition of it is possible, either a priori or a posteriori. More specifically, it is a boundary concept, Grenzbegriff in German, Conceptus terminator in Latin. it brings the cognition of a series of occurrences to completeness by giving it the boundary, terminus, of the series. Likewise, transcendental freedom is a problematic concept that is presupposed in order to think of a first beginning in the origination of action, and so in order to avoid any further regression. In the note 4039, Kant defines a boundary concept in general as that which is to be perfectly comprehensible in itself, whose properties must be conceived in such a way that it can be the principium, so the first term of the series in general, and without any restriction from elsewhere. So an unrestricted, unconditioned being in itself. Among the instances of boundary concepts, Kant lists the absolutely necessary freedom and substance. And it is interesting that also the introduction to the cosmology of the Pollux lectures presents the same characterization of the boundary concept. So if the boundary concept is what remains when all conditions are removed, then freedom means first beginning and absolute contingency. So a beginning that does not need to be preceded by another. By analogy with the concept of absolutely necessary being, Kant characterizes transcendental freedom not only as a boundary concept, but also a necessary hypothesis that grounds the possibility of rational cognition. Both the absolutely necessary being and transcendental freedom are necessary principles for the use of reason. And here, quote, "The highest principium of everything contingent is that which is absolutely necessary, and the highest principium of the possibility of origination is freedom. It is thought that with regard to a freely acting being, every state of affairs that is within its power constitutes a terminum a priori, which is not connected to what has preceded by means of a natural link. In other words, reason must presuppose transcendental freedom as the absolute first beginning in order to account for the determination of an action by grounds other than those in the series of natural causes. Transcendental freedom provides reason with a first ground to begin an action and to bring the series of cognition into completeness, although reason cannot grasp the possibility of freedom." So far, I have illustrated Kant's early discussion of freedom in the context of cosmology, which results from the comparative analysis of the notes on metaphysics at the turn of the silent decade. More familiar, however, is Kant's discussion of freedom in the cosmological sense in the third antinomy of the first critique. In the chapter of the antinomy of pure reason, Kant presents the conflicts that reason comes into while thinking of cosmological ideas, namely while, quote, "making the category into a transcendental idea in order to give absolute completeness to the empirical synthesis through its progress toward the unconditioned." Among the four cosmological ideas, Kant introduces transcendental freedom as the idea, I quote, "of the absolute completeness of the arising, Entstehung, of an appearance in general." Now, we can ask, what is the specific aspect of distinction between the procritical and the critical concepts of transcendental freedom? Taking into account that Kant still has to develop the system of transcendental idealism in its definitive form in the silent decade, and taking also into account the idea that only phenomena, that Kant still has to develop the idea that only phenomena are subject to transcendental conditions, including time, we could ask what makes the early concept of transcendental freedom incompatible with a system of transcendental idealism. And for this purpose, I suggest to compare the aforementioned note 4033 with a passage in the resolution to the third antinomy. And I quote, "By freedom in the cosmological sense, I understand the faculty of beginning a state from itself, the causality of which does not in turn stand under another cause, determine it in time in accordance with the law of nature. So this comparison, actually, I think that it shows first some similarities, namely that transcendental freedom is a form of causality alternative to natural causation, and it responds to reason's demand for an unconditioned totality of the series of conditions. But the comparison of the two passages also suggests that one possible difference might be the different concept of beginning involved in both concepts of freedom, namely a temporal beginning in the sense of origination in the notes and a non-temporal causal beginning in the critique. Although it's true that Kant really mentions time in the notes on freedom, he was aware that the conflict will later be the subject of the third antinomy, namely the necessity of thinking of a causa prima for the series of occurrences, the unconditioned for the series of conditions, and the impossibility to conceive of a first beginning in time, since it violates a rule of the understanding, the principle of sufficient reason, and we've seen it with respect to the note 3922. And moreover, according to Kawamura, around the time of the inaugural dissertation, Kant no longer identifies the first cause with a temporal causal force, as Baumgarten does, for instance, but actually with an intelligible being beyond the series of causes and phenomena. In the dissertation and in other notes from the same period, Kant presents then already a distinction, albeit not yet fully developed, between sensible and intelligible words, and between sensible and intellectual cognition. In the notes, freedom as a principle of origination belongs to the scope of pure metaphysics and is presupposed by reason only through a regressive reasoning. For these reasons, I think that the hypothesis of a different conception of beginning, temporal and dynamical, and consequently of a different conception of the relation between the causality of freedom and time is not sufficient to explain the difference between the two concepts of transcendental freedom. So in order to identify the distinguishing element between the precritical and acritical concept, I suggest focusing on the definition of transcendental freedom as a boundary concept. As we have seen before, the notion of boundary concept implies that transcendental freedom is first a problematic concept of which there can be no cognition either a priori or posteriori, and two, the highest principle of the origination of free action. Moreover, that freedom is a boundary concept of reason also entails that reason must presuppose freedom as a necessary hypothesis for its use. In this respect, the notion of boundary concept may recall Kant's notion of transcendental idea. In a footnote to the first section of the antinomy chapter, Kant observes that, I quote, the absolute whole of the series of conditions for a given condition is always unconditioned, and as such is only an idea, or rather a problematic concept. So the transcendental idea of freedom is a problematic concept representing something unconditioned. In the critique, Kant defines a problematic concept as that which, I quote, contains no contradiction, but also as a boundary for given concepts, the objective reality of which can in no way be cognized. Parallel to this definition, in the note 4491, Kant notes that we can think of a problematic concept, but we cannot either determine it or carry it out, ausführen. Now, in the notes on metaphysics considered so far, Kant makes no observation on the objective reality of freedom. But in the inaugural dissertation, and also in other notes from the same period, Kant states that subjective unintelligibility does not imply objective impossibility. And in the note 3180, freedom as the first beginning of origination is characterized, in analogy to the concept of the absolutely necessary, as, I quote, an essential condition of the user reason, but only as a presupposition, not, however, as a product of it. Therefore, the objective possibility of freedom as the first origination is independent of reason. Freedom, in a way, is an intelligible thing, an intellectualia, that serves as a necessary principle for the use of reason. And in this respect, I think that it is noteworthy that the only occurrence of the notion of the boundary concept, so Grenzbegriff, in the critique, is in relation to the noumenon and its negative use. In contrast, Kant clearly states in the critique that the transcendental idea of freedom is a product of reason because, and here I quote, reason creates the idea of spontaneity, which could start to act from itself without needing to be preceded by any other cause that in turn determine it to action according to the law of causal connection. Hence, I think that what really distinguishes the two concepts of transcendental freedom is their objective reality and their function in relation to reason. In the precritical period, Kant understands transcendental freedom as a metaphysical form of causality, the reality of which is independent of the demands of reason, and the function of which, as a principle, is constitutive for the origination of some occurrences in the world, and also for their cognition. On the contrary, in the critique, transcendental freedom is a transcendental idea that reason brings forth and that has a regulative function. It gives completeness to the series of cognition without presuming the objective reality of what corresponds to the idea of freedom. Then, the objective reality of freedom can be proved only in the practical domain, in terms of a postulate of pure practical reason. So in conclusion, I think that the main difference lies not only and not entirely in the conception of transcendental freedom itself, but also in the different conception of human reason and thus in the different relation between freedom and reason. What is still missing in the notes is not only the system of transcendental idealism, but also clear distinction between theoretical practical reason and their respective transcendental conditions. Kant will later address the question of the relationship between freedom and human reason throughout the silent decade. So the question how reason is capable of such a form of unconditional freedom that grounds both the possibility of practical action and the understanding of this possibility. The clarification of this question also occurs through the incorporation of the notion of absolute spontaneity as reason capacity for active determination into the conceptual scope of transcendental freedom in the Polix lectures and also later. So after the critical turn, transcendental freedom is no longer a metaphysical claim, but transcendental condition of pure reason. But I think that is primarily because of the parallel between the two principles of the absolutely necessary being and freedom, that Kant can introduce a supreme principle, later transcendental condition, that is in itself unconditioned, that can serve as the primary ground for the domain of pure practical reason. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lucia. Now, questions. All right, I see Andrew.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask about what it means for you to say that transcendental freedom in the critical period is no longer a metaphysical claim at all. So, I mean, it does seem as though he gets to it in a different way or in a couple of different ways. I mean, at one point it's a postulate and in the first critique, and then later it starts to look like it's an item of practical knowledge in the second critique and gets related to the factum, of course. But I guess even if it is a transcendental condition of pure practical reason in various ways, can't it still amount to a metaphysical claim? Like it sounds to me like he's still claiming, and even claiming in the mode of knowledge, practical knowledge, that we know some metaphysical fact.
Okay, thank you for your question. Yeah, maybe with metaphysical claim, I meant that is no longer a principle and an object of what the so-called metaphysica specialis, for instance. So there is, although there are a lot of similarities between the pre-critical concept and the critical one, I think that the main difference is, as I said, that Kant does no longer think that transcendental freedom is something real existing. So it's like a noumenon. Or it doesn't think that transcendental freedom is in this way analogous to God as the absolutely necessary being. So it's no more a concept part of the system of the Metaphysica Specialis. So the function, in a way, of a boundary concept of limit, so to say, remains the same. But at the same time, it does not relate to a possible object beyond the possibility and beyond the limit of experience. It has, first of all, this function of condition, of transcendental condition, with only a regulative function for experience or for the theoretical reason, and with a more constitutive function than for practical reason.
I mean, so when we might just have really big differences on how to think about things in themselves and the status of them in the critical philosophy, but consider even when he's just talking about it as a practical postulate, it still looks like, yes, it's not theoretical metaphysics and it's not special metaphysics in the Leibniz-Wolff sense, but it looks to me like for practical reasons, we're postulating a metaphysical entity and committing to it, not in the mode of knowledge, but in the mode of faith or something like that. So it feels to me like, yes, there's a big change in what we want to say regarding our access to this thing, but we're still saying there is this thing, and for practical reasons instead of theoretical reasons.
Yeah, I understand, but I think that the difference is actually that in the pre-critical period, at least the way I read it, in the pre-critical period, transcendental freedom is these things, and is this thing also in the framework of, I mean, there is no distinction between knowledge and faith in this sense, with regard to freedom, in the sense that transcendental freedom is, no, sorry, I'm maybe a bit confused. What I would like to say is that transcendental freedom is an object, is an noumenon, independently of if we look at transcendental freedom from the perspective of knowledge or from the perspective of faith and practical reason. So
okay, so it is an object, as sort of transcendent metaphysical object, and we access it in different ways in different parts of the critical philosophy.
yeah, but I think that this is missing in the pre-critical period.
Right, so there it's a theoretical argument for something like theoretical knowledge. Okay. Yeah, that sounds right. I guess I would just want to resist the idea that you can then say it's not a metaphysical fact, or it's not a noumenon or something substantial. But that's probably a bigger disagreement about boundary concepts and so forth. So, but thank you. It was a great talk. Thank you.
All right, other questions? Dietmar.
Yeah, thanks, Lucia, for your presentation. I was about to ask a similar question that now has been asked by Andrew, but maybe on spontaneity, since spontaneity was not mentioned explicitly, although obviously freedom of the will maybe, and spontaneity somehow seem to be connected in the critical period in particular. So the understanding is spontaneous. And my question is whether you would say that since it is spontaneous, this can be related, of course, to the first antinomy and the third antinomy and everything, so the whole metaphysical background there, would you agree that since the understanding is spontaneous, it must be or is free? And if that is so in the critical period, is it that since you emphasized, I think correctly, that in the critical period, the self-causing of cosmological, or in the cosmological sense of freedom, is non-temporal, such that also the understanding as spontaneous and by implication free is an acting that is non-temporal?
So thank you for the question. I would say, I think that it's important to distinguish the notion of freedom and transcendental freedom and the notion of spontaneity, although it seems in some passages that are actually the same. But I think that if we distinguish, if we separate transcendental freedom, meaning causality, and spontaneity as this capacity of active determination, then we can say in a way that the understanding is spontaneous without implying that it's free, or without implying that the understanding is causing something. I think that it's interesting that Kant says that, for instance, in the Predix lectures, transcendental freedom is the absolute spontaneity of the will. And so it's not that transcendental freedom means absolute spontaneity per se, but transcendental freedom expresses what is the absolute spontaneity of the will, namely this capacity to active determinate and so to cause an action. So I would not say that the understanding is free, that the understanding causes in a way its own act of synthesis, but I would say that the understanding is spontaneous, and so it actively determines all its acts of synthesis without needing further conditions.
So just a very quick follow-up. So you would then say, so we have freedom, laws of nature, and spontaneity, which is neither the one nor the other. So this sounds like as if there's a third kind of option.
I mean, it depends. If we speak of the possibility of how things can be caused, then we have nature of freedom, and so we have the spontaneity of the will, or the spontaneity of reason. If we say, so we regard to causes, but then we regard to faculties and the capacities of faculties, and so the activities of faculties, I think we can say that the spontaneity of the will is spontaneous and free, and that the understanding, is spontaneous, but according to other grounds, and therefore it is not free. I mean, it makes no sense I think, to say that it is free, but it is spontaneous in the sense that it actively determines its own acts according to inner grounds.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. I think I saw a question in the chat. Maybe the person cannot unmute himself. So I'm going to read the question. Does freedom from natural cause presuppose the existence of God?
Sorry, I have to read it. Does freedom from natural cause presuppose the existence of God? I mean, in a way, I would say yes, in the pre-critical period, if we look to some works on, for instance, the universal natural history and also the Beweisgrund, the all impossible argument, it seems that God and the presupposition of God works as a meta principle that grounds the possibility of laws of nature. So in this sense, I would say that in the broad picture, natural cause and the natural law of causality presuppose the possibility of God, as I said, as meta principle.
All right. I think we finished more or less right on time. Thanks again, Lucia. Thanks for the discussion. And without further ado, I think we move on to our second speaker tonight. That's Jing Gao. She is a PhD student at the Martin Luther Universität Halle-Wittenberg. She received her BA in philosophy at Lanzhou University in China, and in 2019, and in 2022, her master in philosophy from the Tsinghua University in Beijing. Since 2023, she's been a PhD student at Halle University under the supervision of Heiner Klemme, working on her dissertation, Rethinking Kant's Practical Freedom and Transcendental Freedom through a Systematic and Developmental Approach. And the title of her talk today is Transcendental and Practical Freedom in the Critique of Pure Reason, a Possible Solution to the Canon Problem. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Professor Pollock, and thanks to the Kant-Gesellschaft for having me. And hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk. Today, my topic is Kant's Transcendental and Practical Freedom in the Critique of Pure Reason. So in this book, both in the dialectic chapter and the canon chapter, Kant introduces practical freedom and transcendental freedom. He says practical freedom is something belongs to the faculty of choice, and its independence from the compelling determination of sensible impulses and its capacity of self-determination by following the dictates of reason. By contrast, transcendental freedom is a cosmological concept. It is the independence from any temporally preceding cause which is governed by the law of nature, and it is the capacity to take itself as the first beginning of the whole series of occurrences in the world. So Kant's descriptions of these two concepts are highly identical. However, his accounts on the relation between them seemingly contradictory, because in the dialectic, Kant emphasized the dependence of practical freedom upon transcendental freedom. Quotation, it is this transcendental idea of freedom on which the practical concept of freedom is grounded, and the abolition of transcendental freedom would also simultaneously eliminate all practical freedom. But later in the canon, Kant emphasizes the divorce between these two concepts. This divorce can be further divided into three levels. First is the level of the current discussion. Kant only specifically discussed the practical freedom, and he set transcendental freedom aside. And the second level is epistemology, because Kant says practical freedom can be cognized through experience as one of the natural causes, while transcendental freedom remains a problem. And the third level is more serious, because Kant says practical freedom can be proven through experience, and such a concept simply cannot be grounded on transcendental freedom. Because if so, we can say it seems like transcendental freedom can also be proven through experience, but it's an idea, as it cannot be so. So, faced with this contradiction, some Kant scholars say Kant here unconsciously puts thoughts from two different periods in the same book. So his accounts in the dialectic is the mature thought, and his accounts in the canon are the remnant from his critical period. He just patches these two different accounts together. But at the same time, we also have anti-patchwork reading. According to this reading, both in the dialectic and in the canon, practical freedom is only one, and it depends upon transcendental freedom. And into this reading, we have two options. The first option is the Genesis and species interpretation raised by Estevez and Kohn. They said, while transcendental freedom is the independence of a certain subject from all natural causes, a practical freedom specifies both the subject as the willing of human beings and all natural causes as psychological causes. The nature of this dependence is ontological or metaphysical, which concerns with the ground of the actual existence. And another option is raised by Allison. According to his interpretation, practical freedom is essentially a different type because transcendental freedom is something belongs to God. It is independent from any sensual affection. But the concept of practical freedom belongs to human beings. We are finite, and we cannot independent from all sensual affections, but can only independent from sensual necessitation. And the nature of dependence is only conceptual, not metaphysical. And this constitutes the first part of canon problem. The second aspect or second part of this problem is derived from the first part. It's about the relation of freedom to morality. In the dialectic, Kant thinks that morality is impossible without practical freedom, and practical freedom is impossible without transcendental freedom. However, in the canon, Kant argues that the moral laws can be possible only on the basis of a naturalized version of practical freedom, without the presupposition of transcendental freedom. And Allison also agreed with this kind of view. And he says this will lead to the heteronomy. And my three central hypotheses for today's talk is the following. First, I think the notion of practical freedom in both sections is only one, and it cannot simply be interpreted as a species of transcendental freedom. Kant's elaborations on this concept are changing, but in a progressive way. And the second, Allison's heteronomy charge is only an artifact of secondary literature, which steps from a retrospective point of view, which is they tries to evaluate the moral law, the moral theory in the canon from the standpoint of Kant's later writing. But Kant himself would hardly admit that there is a deficiency or fatal flaw in the canon, because in the canon or in the first critique, Kant's primary goal is not to develop a mature moral incentive, but to explore a unity of morality and happiness, or of reason and nature. Technically speaking, there is no autonomy nor heteronomy in the canon. Rather, it proceeds towards autonomy, or using the term by Timmerman, autonomy emerges from there. And from the following, I first refute the Genesis species interpretation because of 4 reasons. The first one is it adapts to inappropriate textual support. As I won't read it, but this short text are from a remark on the third autonomy on the thesis. So this Kant is not express his own opinions, but rather the opinions he tries to refute. And the second is Kant himself knows the genesis and species, but he doesn't use it to describe the relation between these 2 freedoms. And the third reason is, if we regard something as a genesis, we must at least have certain knowledge or cognition of its essence. But in Kant's view, we can only have thoughts that can never have cognitions about transcendental freedom. And the fourth reason is the species beneath this genesis is supposed to possess all the key features of this genesis. For example, human beings are one species of animals. Animals have perceptions. So human beings also have perception and also have their own distinctive characteristic. For example, according to Aristotle, we have the thinking part and the intellect. By contrast, transcendental freedom is in a cosmological sense. It is devoted to refer the first cause of the whole world. By contrast, the subject of practical freedom as human beings is not a cosmological concept. And right now I want to analyze in the dialectic which kind of dependence. So there are 2 points. The first is the essence of the dependence of practical freedom upon transcendental freedom. The second is the denotation of the term practical freedom. The first one, the essence, is it a metaphysical essence or conceptual essence? If it's a metaphysical essence, it means the actual existence of practical freedom totally rests on the transcendental freedom. Once transcendental freedom couldn't be proven to actually exist, then practical freedom also falls into fantasy. But the conceptual sense is much weaker. If we want to make sense of how the practical freedom is possible, we have to turn to practical freedom. So I think in the dialectic, Kant only intends to show that the concept of transcendental freedom doesn't violate the principle of contradictions, and thus it has logical possibility. His concern is very modest, and a metaphysical reading to his arguments would burden him with a heavier task he refused to perform. And Kant only want to try to answer the following question: why the practical freedom is possible? This is a problem because rational beings are located within the world, which is only dominated by the laws of nature. And according to these laws, sensible impulses are temporally preceding cause, which is necessarily determining the sensible faculty of choice. But Kant cannot find the answer until he expounds the issue of independence of freedom into a cosmological room. In this room, if we think transcendental freedom with contradiction, it must be out of temporal sequence. This can only be accomplished by reason, for reason is capable to give a special causality, and this kind of causality allows agents to possess reason to think themselves as jumping out of the temporal sequence. And regarding to the second aspect, the denotation of the term practical freedom, Bernd Ludwig thinks under the practical freedom, we have two different levels. The first level is only the independence from the immediate sensory impulses, and the second level is the independence from all sensible determining grounds, and only the second level is dependent upon transcendental freedom, whereas the first level is not. And my initial objection will be too abrupt, because after Kant defines the concept of practical freedom in a wide sense, and this is the first half of A534, it would be too abrupt that without any hint, he suddenly narrows down the scope when he talks about the dependence on transcendental freedom. And this is the another half of A534. And I think it's really interesting to think the following questions to Ludwig's interpretation. The first one is, what's the common or defining characteristic of these two different levels? And second, why the second level or the higher level is predominant in the dialectic and the lower level in the canon? And my tentative answer is, to the first question, the independence of the faculty of choice from any particular sensible impulses. This is a low standard, but it is this low standard or loose criteria that make practical freedom recognizable and unique. Both levels meet this low standard, and therefore they are counted as practical freedom. And the second question, why the second level is predominant in the dialectic, is because in the dialectic, Kant copes with the possibility of practical freedom. How is it possible for the faculty of choice to be free from all sensible impulses? And this independence are not the fact, but how we think. Why do we think this way? Because we want to, or Kant want to say, every action which is guided by an art can be imputed to its agents. And in the canon, Kant only addresses the actuality of practical freedom of the first level. And here, Kant focused no longer on the practical, the possibility of practical freedom, but only the practical freedom itself. And practical freedom does exist, not our supposition. And Kant only addresses here the actuality of the lower level, and the higher level is set aside or left open. Why is so? I think because the former is more easier, because it's conformed to common sense, and the later is more challenging. It's counterintuitive, and it's more argument. And the second part, the heteronomy charge, it's raised by Allison. Allison think the moral theory in canon is a heteronomy because the real incentive for obeying moral law is a desire for the happiness. But I want to defend Kant by mentioning a fact. In the 1781, Kant published the first edition of the first critique, and 4 years later, the groundwork, and 2 years later, the second edition of the practical reason, and the pure reason, and 1 year later, he published the Critique of Practical Reason. And in the second edition, Kant has not changed any word of this programmatic passage, even if he has already developed the notion of autonomy and that of respect for the moral law. So based on this fact, my assumption is the heteronomy charge is an artifact of sanctuary literature. For Kant, the passage is compatible or suitable for his whole structure, and it's more appropriate to fully bring up the new thoughts of respect for the moral law, the autonomy, into another book. What Allison refers the radical change between the first critique and the second critique in regard to the moral theory doesn't exist. And my assumption can be supported by this citation. Kant himself made a declaration of the second edition. He didn't alter either in the propositions themselves or in their grounds of proof. And everything in the first critique is an organ in which everything is for the sake of each member, and each individual member is for the sake of all. And if he has the least frailty, it must be betray itself in its use. So I think we can ask two follow-up questions. What is the contribution of the problematic passage to the general picture of canon? And then what's the contribution of canon to the first critique? So I think that if we look at the whole picture of canon, Kant never say, I, Immanuel Kant, declare to explore the real moral intentives. No, technically speaking, he only says, I search for, or I investigate a canon of pure reason. And what is a canon? Canon is not, like Allison says, only the actions of and omissions insofar as they are sanctioned by reason. More than that, a canon can reveal that there is God and there is a future. And this is a relevant citation. And how can a canon reveal these two things? It's because these two things are necessary for the highest good, which is a combination of both morality and happiness. And in this combination, it's enough for Kant's aim. It's like a raw stone. If we want to have real moral incentive, we have to purify it to get a real diamond. But we cannot just say the raw stone is essentially different from the diamond. And if I still have some time, Allison just used this citation to support his argument. But I want to say the majority idea of morality in this citation is not the moral law, but a more general thing, which the Geisman specifies as the idea of the highest good. And the idea is a moral world constituted according to these laws. And in this world, the idea of proportionality of morality and happiness will be realized. And this is what the second part of this citation, the whole end, really about. So this will be my presentation today. Thank you for your hearing.
All right, thank you. Great. Other questions? Karin.
Yes, thanks, Jingo, for your talk. I thought it was very interesting and, as far as I could tell, also convincing. I have one small remark and then a question. I think that I think your reconstruction is convincing, but I don't think that you can really rely on Kant's own presentation of the changes in the second edition, because he might be wrong. You see what I mean? Yeah, so it's I think not very strong to use Kant's own views on what he changed and what he did not change. as a reason for your own arguments. Yeah, because that implies that we have to trust Kant for knowing very well what he had done. Yeah, so that's a small comment. Yes, I think we need to be more careful there. But my question concerns something you said about the dialectic, because at some point you contrasted the dialectic and the canon by saying, look, in the context of the transcendental dialectic, Kant is concerned with the possibility of practical freedom and not with the actuality. Okay, but it seems to me that Kant, in the context of the antinomy, or of the third antinomy, is concerned with transcendental freedom and not really with the possibility of practical freedom itself. Yes, because he's reflecting on assumptions that concern cosmology and not practical philosophy. Now, I think that you have a view on the relation between transcendental freedom and practical freedom, but I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how you see the role of transcendental freedom and practical freedom in the context of the third antinomy. And whether something like the possibility of practical freedom is already at stake in the third antinomy.
Okay, thank you for your nice questions. The first is about the remark. I agree with your opinion. It's not enough just quoting Kant and say he's right. So I think it reflects about my own methodology. I think I should show some mercy at Kant. So not just refute what he want to say, but firstly, trying to know what he really say and try to defend him. If I failed, then I will turn to another option. Because I think to refute someone is much easier than fully understand someone.
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
Yeah, and the second point, I think you are right. Both transcendental freedom and practical freedom are mentioned in the dialectic. And the whole third antinomy is in a cosmological space. But I think why he choose this cosmological room, his real concern is about practical freedom. So it's Professor Hoefer also mentioned it in his book, the commentary of the first critique. He says even Kant talks about transcendental freedom and cosmological sense. His real concern is practical freedom. It's in order to solve the problems in the practical sphere, he resort to the cosmological sense.
Yeah, I think I might disagree with this somewhat. Yes, because I think that Kant in the Antinomy of Pure Reason chapter really focuses on assumptions in cosmology and reflects on these assumptions and on how they create the conflicts and so on. So I see that in general that practical freedom is crucial for Kant, but I think I would hesitate to somehow introduce the problem of practical freedom already in the Antinomy of Pure Reason itself.
Because in this part, maybe the third part, he talks a lot about a lie. Could you remember that passage?
About?
About a lie. And he also talks about the intellectual characteristic, intellectual character and empirical character, and these are in parallel with practical freedom and the transcendental freedom.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Thank you.
All right, let's see. Well, there's a question in the chat. Is there a dialectic between practical freedom and transcendental freedom? Maybe we need a little comment on what you mean by dialectic. I mean, I'm not the addressee of this question, but how about this? Why don't you comment like with one sentence on what you mean by, is there a dialectic between, and meanwhile I'll call on John for your question. How about this?
Sure, thank you. And yeah, thanks, Jing, for your talk. I had a clarificatory question. So you mentioned Ludwig's view that there are two, I think what you say, levels to the concept of practical freedom. And you had an objection to his view, or at least to his presentation of it, that it's too abrupt. And as I understood you, then you essentially advocate the same kind of view, but then give a fuller explanation of why this kind of two-level view is convincing. Is that correct? And then I had a second question about a claim you made about rejecting practical freedom as a species of transcendental freedom. And you said, well, transcendental freedom is about a world cause, and practical freedom is about the human being. And so you mentioned in your response to Karen's question about that Kant invokes the human being in the resolution of the third antinomy. And so what do you make of that and of his claims in the resolution of the third antinomy that we have reason to assume or to conceive of ourselves as transcendently free by virtue of imperatives that we represent to ourselves? What do you take to be at issue there? Is that transcendental freedom with respect to the human being, or is that practical freedom? And ultimately, do you reject the view that self-determination in the guise of practical freedom is to be regarded as transcendentally free, in the sense that the self-determination of the will is not an absolute beginning?
Thanks, John. Your first comment, I think my own opinion is practical freedom. The definition of practical freedom is only one, and this definition set a low bar, set a low standard. So both levels can meet this standard and then can be qualified to be practically free. And both in the dialectic and in the canon, Kant leave room for both levels. It's not in the dialectic only the higher level, in the canon only the lower level. And your second point, could you please explain it one more time? I'm afraid I don't fully understand your question.
I was just trying to get some clarity on how you conceive of the relationship between transcendental and practical freedom. It seemed that to be the case that at one point you said transcendental freedom pertains to like a world beginning, and that practical freedom pertains to the human being. And yet, in the resolution of the third antinomy, Kant invokes the human being in his characterization of freedom quite frequently, as you also admitted when you, in response to Karen's questions about the human being's intelligible and empirical character. And he claims at one point that we have reason to assume that we have this kind of freedom, or to at least consider ourselves to have what he seems to say transcendental freedom by virtue of imperatives that we represent to ourselves. And so my question was, what do you make of these types of claims, and what do you make of the relationship between transcendental and practical freedom when he invokes the human being in the resolution of the third antinomy?
I think in the third antinomy, Kant's definition of practical freedom is different from his definition of transcendental freedom, because transcendental freedom here only in the cosmological sense, and the practical freedom belongs to human beings, and it's only in order to make sense of the human beings' action we resort to transcendental freedom, that we cannot directly say human beings are transcendentally free.
All right. Thanks for your answer. I think David just commented on his question. I'm going to read so the question was, is there a dialectic between practical freedom and transcendental freedom? And he comments on this by saying the dialectic is a dynamic one, whereby practical freedom is a synthesis that arises from the possibility of transcendental freedom. Does that make sense to you, Jean?
I maybe need more explanation of synthesis. I don't want to take too much time, so maybe we can communicate with each other in an email.
All right.
Oh.
Well, thanks for the suggestion, right? Okay, so thanks again, Jing, for the talk and the discussion.
Thank you.
And we now move on to our third and final speaker, Julian Grebe. He's a PhD student at the University of Luxembourg. He received his BA in Philosophy and Information Processing from the University of Cologne in 2021, and his Master in Philosophy in 2023 at the University of Luxembourg. Since 2023, he's been a PhD student at the University of Luxembourg, where his supervisor is Dietmar Heidemann. And the topic of his dissertation is Kant's dialectic of teleological judgment and its antinomy. And the title of his talk today is Transcendental Illusion in Kant's dialectic of teleological judgment. So, thanks, Julian.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks so much for the friendly introduction, and I'm very grateful also for the organization of this event, and also grateful for the Kant-Gesellschaft who provided me with this opportunity to talk here today. And also thanks for all the people who took the time to be here. I will also share my screen, 1 second. Can you see that? Here?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So the title might already suggest or give a hint of what I will talk about I'm going to argue for a systematic connection in Kant's philosophy that is not at all obvious and might be, on the contrary, quite controversial. The term transcendental illusion is an important one Kant talks about in the beginning of the transcendental dialectic of the first critique. But the scope of this term is seemingly exhausted by the specific objective of the first critique's dialectic, namely to build a new critical foundation of philosophy that is superior to the dogmatic alternatives. Contrary to this view, I will try to show that transcendental illusion continues to play a fundamental role in Kant's thought. Accepting this claim might also help us to solve an interpretational problem that we face when trying to make sense of the dialectic of teleological judgment in the third critique. And with this in mind, it makes sense to divide my argument into two parts. In the first part, I will justify the assumption that transcendental illusion is indeed a continuous phenomenon that drives Kant's dialectical considerations, at least until the third critique. The second part will explore interesting implications of this assumption with regards to the question of how to understand the antinomy of teleological judgment. So I want to start part one by providing a general outline of what transcendental illusion actually is. One central aspect of transcendental illusion is that it is unavoidable. Kant uses a metaphor to emphasize this point. He calls transcendental illusion, I quote, an illusion that cannot be avoided at all, just as little as we can avoid it that the sea appears higher in the middle than at the shores, end of quote. It is also clear that transcendental illusion is a consequence of the functionality of reason. Other than the unproblematic logical use, the real use of reason posits the real existence of unconditioned objects and thus makes ontological claims about the soul, the world, and God. According to Kant, this leads to dialectical problems that cannot be avoided but only resolved by critique. So in summary, transcendental illusion is natural and unavoidable because it is closely connected to the faculty of reason itself. Still, it can be prevented to deceive when reason criticizes itself, what is the title of the critique of pure reason, and sees through its own illusion. I will now turn to the question in what specific sense illusion is linked to reason, or in other words, what exactly makes the illusion natural and unavoidable. So there are basically two different positions in the literature. On the one hand, transcendental illusion is necessarily and directly linked with the faculty of reason. This view takes the meaning of unavoidable in a stronger sense, because reason without illusion would not even be a possibility, as its functionality depends on it in a way. Illusion would therefore still be a part of critical philosophy as well. On the other hand, it is claimed that transcendental illusion is only contingently and indirectly linked with the faculty of reason. This implies a weaker sense of unavoidable and natural, as it is at least conceivable that reason functions without this illusion. From this latter perspective, illusion depends on the acceptance of transcendental realism as a metaphysical framework. The naturalness of the illusion would then simply derive from the naturalness of human reason's inclination towards transcendental realism. I will, from now on, assume that the second understanding is the superior one. Due to the limited time, I will only superficially point out some arguments in favor of it. First, there are quite a few passages where Kant calls transcendental realism the common and natural worldview. For example, in B 549 or in the Prolegomena in paragraph 52. Second, Kant explicitly says that the dialectical proofs of the antinomical propositions are only valid if one holds appearances for things in themselves. And this one can find in B 535. Third, transcendental idealism is supposed to be the key for preventing this illusion from deceiving. This also suggests that it does not depend on, that it is independent, the illusion, from transcendental idealism and critical philosophy. My further argument will therefore be based on the apparently justified assumption that transcendental illusion is the consequence of reason's natural and unavoidable inclination towards the metaphysical view of transcendental realism. I would now like to propose the following idea. Transcendental illusion, as it has been characterized before, underlies not only the transcendental dialectic, but also every other dialectic in Kant's philosophy. Metaphorically speaking, it would be the common root of dialectical problems in general. I will later show how that especially makes sense when considering the dialectic of the teleological power of judgment. While I have to admit that I'm not aware of any explicit usage of the term transcendental illusion outside of the transcendental dialectic in the first critique, yet there is at least one passage in the critique of the power of judgment that appeared, that got published 9 years later, where Kant seems to at least implicitly refer to transcendental illusion. And this is namely a quote from the dialectic of the aesthetic power of judgment. And I would like to read it together with you as it is quite important for my further argument. So I quote, "There are three kinds of antinomy of pure reason which, however, all coincide in this, that they force reason to give up the otherwise very natural presupposition that holds objects of the senses to be things in themselves, and rather to count them as appearances. That there are three kinds of antinomy is grounded in the fact that there are three cognitive faculties: understanding, the power of judgment, and reason, in the sense practical reason, because it's about the critique of practical reason, each of which must have its a priori principles, for then reason demands with regard to all of them the unconditioned for the given conditioned." There are now two strong indications in this quote that I have marked yellow, these indications. First, he points out that all antinomies are a consequence of the common assumption that transcendental realism is true. Second, all antinomies are the result of the function of reason that searches an unconditioned object. We can therefore make a strong case for the assumption that the notion of transcendental illusion still plays a fundamental role 9 years later in the critique of the power of judgment. And this leads me to the second part of my talk, where I will now consider a specific interpretational problem we face when trying to make sense of the dialectic of teleological judgment. Kant there points out the following dilemma. When we try to explain the processes in nature through general laws, we end up with two conflicting ideas. On the one hand, the formation of most empirical objects can be explained through external causes. For example, rock formation, you can see on the left, has a specific structure and shape because of the influence of, for example, wind, water, or maybe also some collision of earth plates. On the other hand, the formation of some objects seem to be only explainable by reference to an additional internal cause, an inner purpose. For example, an oak sprout seemingly has some information, like an internal image, one could say, of what form it will try to achieve. Kant captures this conflict between mechanism on the one hand and teleology on the other hand by formulating an antinomy of teleological judgment. There's now an ongoing debate about the question what exactly the antinomy of teleological judgment is. This is not obvious because Kant gives not only one, but two formulations of this conflict. The regulative formulation consists of two propositions about how we have to subjectively approach processes in nature. Kant also calls them maxims. You can see them on the left. The constitutive propositions on the right, however, entail objective or ontological claims about the real essence of natural processes. I will now present two arguments for the currently predominant position that locates the antinomy between the regulative maxims. The first argument, I call it the necessity argument, rests on the following two assumptions. First, it is a necessary condition for an antinomy that the two conflicting propositions are, at least seemingly, necessary. If an antinomy consists of two conflicting claims that are simply made up, it would not have any persuasive argumentative force. This is also clear from the fact that Kant offered elaborate proofs for both sides in the course of the antinomy of pure reason. The second assumption of the argument claims that only the regulative maxims and not the constitutive propositions can claim to be necessary in this way. There is indeed a quote where Kant explicitly speaks of a quote, necessary maxims of the reflecting power of judgment. That's in paragraph 69 in the third critique. In contrast to this, there is not real textual evidence at all that the constitutive propositions are in any way necessary. Kant even says that, I quote, reason is unable to prove either one or the other of these constitutive principles. Therefore, it is concluded that the real antinomy must happen between the regulative maxims. A second argument, I call it the faculty argument, comes to the same conclusion from another angle. It is first assumed that the real antinomy Kant is concerned with belongs to the faculty of reflecting judgment. This seems obvious because Kant repeatedly talks about an antinomy of the power of judgment, for example, in the title of paragraph 69. It is then further argued that only the regulative conflict can belong to the faculty of reflecting judgment. The constitutive conflict would not be a conflict that belongs to reflecting judgment, but instead to reason. To justify the second premise, one can refer to a passage where Kant says that the constitutive conflict would be, I quote, an antinomy certainly, though not one of judgment, but rather a conflict in the legislation of reason, end of quote. One can see from this that the currently predominant understanding is well justified and supported by quite some textual evidence. Yet, I want to suggest an alternative reading of the antinomy that defends the thesis according to which the antinomy happens between the constitutive propositions. I will defend this alternative interpretation against the two prior arguments and also point out why it might be superior for mainly systematic reasons. My first claim is pretty simple. I propose that Kant holds the constitutive propositions to be conditionally necessary as long as transcendental realism is accepted. Because human reason is naturally and necessarily inclined towards accepting transcendental realism, it is also necessarily inclined to transform the regulative maxims into objective claims. We can therefore reject the second premise of the necessity argument, according to which the constitutive principles are arbitrarily formed. Instead, their necessity can be derived from the necessity of the maxims, plus the nature of our human reason that has this necessary inclination towards transcendental realism that cannot be avoided. My second claim is following this idea and proposes that the antinomy of teleological judgment would belong to reflecting judgment and reason at the same time. While the maxims of reflecting judgment are the starting point that first enables the conflict, it turns out as essentially an antinomy of the faculty of reason. This idea is well compatible with the earlier quote that every kind of antinomy at first happens between principles of a specific faculty of cognition, understanding, practical reason, or the power of judgment, that are afterwards unconditionally extended by reason. Apart from these more systematic considerations, I think there's also textual evidence that supports my two claims. I would particularly like to highlight the following quote. So here Kant says, the power of judgment can set out from two maxims in its reflection, one of which is provided to it by the mere understanding a priori, the other of which, however, is suggested by particular experiences that bring reason into play in order to conduct the judging of corporeal nature and its laws in accordance with a special principle. So I now think that there is a hidden ambiguity that is lost, especially in the English translation. It is about the question to what word the pronoun that in the three words marked in yellow, the last one, that refers to. In the English translation, it would unquestionably be the particular experiences right before. When we take a look at the original German quote, however, there are actually two options. It can either refer to the particular experiences or besondere Erfahrungen, or the two maxims, zwei Maximen. I think that the latter is the correct one for a few reasons. First, if welche would refer to particular experiences, then reason would merely be involved in the formation of the teleological maxim. But it is said that reason does the judging of corporeal nature and its laws. Yet it seems strange to think that a maxim can be used to make such determining judgments. Additionally, the second maxim only applies to some objects in nature, namely organisms. But reason is judging not only organic nature, but corporeal nature in general, Kant says. Third, it seems clear that the maxims do not belong to reason, but to reflecting judgment. It is quite implausible then to suddenly assume that reason is involved in bringing about the teleological maxim. It makes more sense to say that both maxims bring reason into play to form the constitutive propositions that Kant a little bit later actually calls, I quote, a conflict in the legislation of reason. I want to conclude my talk by naming some implications and also some advantages and disadvantages of my reading. I think that the main advantage is that one is able to integrate the dialectic of teleological judgment in Kant's philosophical system, namely about when considering the idea that transcendental illusion has actually this continuous meaning and role to play. One is also able to integrate or explain the role of paragraph 72 and 73 in the dialectic of teleological judgment, where Kant is criticizing the dogmatic systems regarding the question of teleology or natural purposes. If one would take the antinomy to consist between the regulative principles, then it seems weird why would Kant even talk about dogmatic systems or answers to those questions when it's not really about when the antinomy not really is about the constitutive principles at all. This, for my reading, the constitutive formulation has a clear role to play and is not superfluous. But I have to admit that sometimes it's a bit unclear and not so easy to find clear textual evidence for my reading. I have suggested that we should interpret a certain passage in another way. But apart from that, I guess there's still a lot of ambiguity left, and I will still need to think about it more. And I'm looking forward to the ideas you might have. Thank you so much.
All right. Nice. Thanks for your talk, Julian. Questions? If you could take down the PowerPoint, I guess I would be able to see more faces and could spot questions. Yes, Fahad.
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. So you didn't talk much about your main claim that you take the transcendental illusion to be the common ground of all the other antinomies across the board. So I was wondering, what is your motivation behind this claim? So you didn't talk much about that claim, because if my memory serves, the definition Kant gives in the antinomy, the illusion arises when so we have two faculties there. We have the understanding and sensibility, and transcendental illusion arises out of these two faculties alone. So I wonder how it can be explained in terms of other faculties in other works. So I'm not clear about how, and there must be a good reason why Kant does not talk about transcendental illusion in other words in this sense as well. So yeah, I would appreciate if you can tell more about your motivation behind this claim. Thank you.
Sure, thanks a lot for your question. Yeah, of course, I have to admit, and I even said that it's controversial, and he doesn't really specifically, explicitly talk about transcendental illusion afterwards. But I've tried to show, for example, the quote in the dialectic of the aesthetic power of judgment, where Kant is not, while not talking about transcendental illusion specifically, he is saying that reason for all faculties, for understanding, for practical reason, and for judgment, does this unconditional extension. And I think that is exactly what transcendental illusion is. And so I think this quote is quite enough to make my point, or to justify this assumption that we have this continuous underlying problem that motivates every kind of dialectic, even when Kant is not explicitly referring to it every time. And yeah, it is true that the dialectic of teleological judgment is not named there. It's only about the three ones: the critique of pure reason, of practical reason, and the power of aesthetic judgment, the critique of aesthetic judgment. But I think that has simply to do with the fact that Kant wasn't aware, while writing the dialectic of aesthetic judgment, that he would extend it to also include teleology at this point. It's clear from some letters Kant wrote in 1789, I think, in the beginning. It was a pretty late decision, one could say, to include teleology, and so it makes sense to also think that if he would have known there's a dialectic of teleological judgment, he would have included it in this quote and also made it more explicit that it is also, when the power of judgment is concerned about teleology, that reason also does this unconditional extension of some principles that he talks about in the dialectic of aesthetic judgment. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a suggestion. I think it's interesting, but maybe not so easy to argue for. Yeah, maybe I should think about it more.
Thank you so much.
All right, fair enough. Luis, you have a question?
Yes. So thank you so much, Julian. I think it was really clear. I really enjoyed your talk. And I have a question because I'm trying to understand your claim. And so there are some older readings of the dialectic that also go in this direction to say that the constitutive conflict is the antinomy. But an objection that was made against this reading is that if the antinomy is between the constitutive judgments, then this might suggest that the mere transformation of the constitutive judgments into regulative ones would already solve the antinomy. And if this is the case, the antinomy would be solved in section 70, which is a section titled The Representation of the Antinomy. And then Kant writes,
you mean preparation,
8 or 9
right?
sections afterwards. Then the question is, what is he doing there if the antinomy is already solved, right? So this was an objection that they received at the time. And I was wondering if you think that this objection, if you could address this objection from your perspective, from the perspective of your reading. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. This is a very interesting objection as well, which I also struggle to answer. But here's my view on it. I would suggest that it's not, Kant needs to still provide a diagnosis why we cannot do this further step from regulative to constitutive principles. Just simply stating that we cannot do it is not really enough. It's not really sufficient to give a full resolution of an antinomy, especially when this step, as I've argued, is in a way necessary when we are supposing that transcendental realism is the true framework. So it's not really sufficient for a resolution of an antinomy to simply point out, yeah, we cannot do it, without giving further explanation of why we cannot do it. It's a preparation of resolution. You are right, this is the title, but I think it's just preparation in the sense that Kant already hints about that we should not do this step from regulative to constitutive. But in my view, it is not enough because there is actually a necessity, a conditional necessity when we follow the wrong metaphysical framework, so to say. And I would say, and I will try to look more into it, it's not something I haven't dealt with a lot yet, but I guess in the second part of the dialectic, it's about the diagnosis. Why is it actually the case that we are limited and we cannot do this or should not do this jump from regulative to constitutive? So I think there's further explanation needed. And also the integration of the dogmatic systems is quite interesting. We have their Spinozism, which I think Kant would say he's a transcendental realist. And he also wants to include a criticism of these kind of other systems that were in a way popular during his time, Spinozism in a way, and to also say how they lead to this antinomy. And this would also be an explanation why it is not finished yet.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I might have a second question, but I can also ask you afterwards. Yeah, thanks.
All right, are there other questions? Yes, there's one, Previn. Go ahead.
Hi, Julian. That was a really provocative presentation. Thank you very much for that. I certainly have got a huge amount to think about because I think you're hitting some very foundational assumptions. I think in your last ending comments just now about this relation between the regulative and the constitutive, and can we move from the regulative to the constitutive? So, and that's, I think it's massive if you can show that we can. because, as you say, Kant says we can't. Now, my very basic understanding of why Kant is in that position is because the regulative is connected with dialectic, which is connected with illusion, which is connected with the noumenal. And the fear is that if you translate anything in that realm, the noumenal, the regulative, into the sensible and constitutive through the claim of necessity, you fall into an amphiboly. You start to treat the noumenal as a reality when it is got to, for Kant, remain unknowable. Otherwise, it loses its capacity for regulation or to be purely regulative. So I was wondering, really, I wanted to push you on what is your definition of the dialectic? Why did Kant need a dialectic at all? Why did he split off CPR, the first critique, into a whole section on the dialectic, which begins with, oh, you know, there's an illusion going on here that's unavoidable in reason. And I think that is the problematic of the regulative and the noumenal, because your fundamental question is does teleology belong to the regulative and the noumenal, or does teleology belong to the constitutive and the faculty of the understanding? And for me, anyway, understanding really falls apart in the dialectic. All it can do is say, look, this is illusion. It doesn't have the capacity to translate what reason is trying to give us. It just doesn't have the capacity to make it real. It's just like, this is just illusion. So where do you position teleology? Because I think Kant would want to push it into that regulative noumenal space. And that's why he's got the dialectic in the third critique. So there's some questions around what is your definition of dialectic? Why does Kant even have a dialectic in the first critique? What's its relation to the regulative constitutive conflict? And then does teleology, what does teleology, how can teleology belong to the constitutive rather than the regulative noumenal?
Thank you so much for those questions. I think, I'm not sure if I really have understood everything. I will try to answer. So one question was, because I'm also not so familiar with some terminology you used, some question was why the dialectic in the first critique and why the dialectic in the third critique, right? So why dialectic? I think one big reason is to also diagnose the failing of traditional metaphysical systems, right? To criticize them. And I think this is also a big reason for what motivates the dialectic in the third critique, because Kant is then also criticizing Spinozism and atomism, for example, or theism, those who take teleology to be something real or something non-existent at all. Some would say we can make constitutive judgments that teleology is something like a fairy tale. We should not use it at all, like Spinoza, for example, would say. And Kant is saying this is like a false dichotomy, right? And I think this is one reason, and also to argue probably for his own system of transcendental idealism, which is then the only way, fortunately, to solve this kind of problem, to not get into an antinomy. And you also asked about what role exactly teleology has then in Kant's philosophy, right? I'm not sure. I would definitely say there's a regulative role, but I would say one should not focus too much on teleology, but also say respect that Kant always says we have to follow this mechanistic way of explaining stuff as far as possible. So in a way, teleology is not a positive principle that we have, but it's kind of necessitated by some experiences of objects that we cannot explain mechanically yet. I'm not sure about if we were to classify it as we can never explain them mechanistically. But so I think it's just yeah, a modest claim maybe that as long as we cannot use mechanism to explain those processes, we have to use another maxim. But this cannot, we can never be in a position to make a constitutive claim about these principles. I think I left a lot out from what you asked, but is that satisfactory in any way or helpful?
Yeah, I think I'll try and get in touch with you on email because I did find your presentation very challenging. But I have a thing about the difference between the faculty of reason and the faculty of understanding as the central split in the first critique. And that is the causality of the dialectic. That's what provoked Kant to go there. But that's a big discussion because there are so many assumptions here. So yeah, but thank you. That was a great presentation. I have to try to stop thinking about it this evening, but thank you.
All right. All right. No, I think, do we have another question? I don't think we have another. Well, Luis, do we have time for one more quick question?
Yes, we can have a last one. Yeah.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. I have some problems with my internet and change the room. First, I want to have the chance to say hello to my old fellow Konstantin. Hello, Konstantin,
Hi.
with whom I had a lot of good times 30 years ago in Bamberg, when he was in Bamberg. But now I have a question to Julian Greve. When Kant is talking about human reason, do you think it is a terminological mistake, or is it also a logical mistake to talk of human reason? Because reason is not human, reason is reason, and reason is objective validity, and that is not human. Human beings can be in error and can be in truth, but the reason itself can never be in error. So then when we talk about the dialectic of reason, do we talk about the dialectic and antinomies of reason itself? Or do we talk about our human use of reason, which is sometimes a reasonable use and sometimes a not reasonable use of reason? So the dialectic, is it the reason itself, or is it in our use of reason? And the second question is, when the dialectic is, and also the illusion is in our use of reason, maybe it is not only a thought, this illusion, is it also possible that the illusions and dialectics have are a good means or have a positive meaning and not only a negative meaning for the progress of our knowledge?
Thank you so much for your questions. I think they are quite interesting and touch upon many things that yeah, I would like to argue for. So first you ask if there's a distinction between reason in general and human reason specifically. I would say yes. I would say Kant is always considering in the dialectic human reason, which is a finite reason. It is not an intuitive understanding. It is a discursive understanding in a way. And it also has these kind of very specific forms of intuition that are time and space. And through this, there is this, I would say, this transcendental illusion only arises for human reason. It's not connected to reason in general. We could have reason without illusion, so to say, but that would not be human reason. That would be my answer to the first part of the question. Then you ask about if dialectics also have a positive function. That I would say it depends. Kant seems to think, yeah, they definitely have a positive function by just clearing the way, right? To, I mean, if one can prevent an illusion from deceiving, then it's pretty useful in a way because we can make progress in the right way when we do not follow this wrong way. Apart from that, I'm not so sure if there's another really positive aspect of the dialectic, especially regarding the dialectic of teleological judgment. because it's kind of, he makes a very modest case in my view. And he's not saying, yeah, we should definitely use teleology in biology, or we should only use mechanistic vocabulary when doing natural sciences. He's saying, yeah, it's in this way very negative, and it's also a little bit unsatisfying for me right now, but I still need to think about it more to answer these kinds of questions about the practical or use of solving a dialectic. Thank you.
Let me say one sentence to your answer, Julian Greve. I think it's a difference whether you say there are two reasons, a human reason and a non-human reason. And the other difference is what I'm saying, there's only one reason, and maybe there's a human use of reason, but that is not a fixed human reason, but it's a human use of a fixed reason. And that's really a difference whether there are two reasons or only one reason. And I suppose there can only be one reason, not an absolute reason and a human reason. It's one reason, and then it's a human use of reason. That's the difference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I've never thought about it like this, but I'm glad to be pointed out to this possibility. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again to our three speakers and the discussion. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Luis and the organizers.
Okay, so thank you so much, Konstantin, for chairing this session. It was a very productive one. Many thanks to the three speakers, and special thanks also to Dietmar Heidemann for putting the session together. I think it was very successful. I will just post here on the chat the schedule. So the next session of the VKC will also be the last one. And will be curated by the UK Kant Society. And it will be a special session. Apart from being the last, it will include also a panel with representatives of UK-based journals, such as Mind, the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, and the EJP. And they will do a panel with Q&A about publishing on Kant in these journals. So I think you're all very welcome to join. And I think it will be December 19, 3 p.m., but you can check on the schedule. I just posted here on the chat. So many thanks, and we'll keep the Zoom meeting open, so you're all very welcome to stay further for more informal conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.